scripture today comes from Mark 8, 1 to 10, and I think you already know what the scripture is, but let's read it word for word. About this time, another large crowd had gathered, and the people ran out of food again. Jesus called his disciples and told them, "I feel sorry for these people. They have been here with me for 3 days, and they have nothing left to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will faint along the way, for some of them have come a long distance." His disciples replied, "How are we supposed to find enough food to feed them out here in the wilderness?" Jesus asked, "How much bread do you have?" 7 loaves, they replied. So Jesus told all the people to sit down on the ground. Then he took the 7 loaves, thanked God for them, and broke them into pieces. He gave them to his disciples, who distributed the bread to the crowd. A few small fish were found too, so Jesus also blessed these and told the disciples to distribute them. They ate as much as they wanted. Afterwards, the disciple picked up 7 large baskets of leftover food. There were about 4,000 men in this crowd that day, and Jesus sent them home after they had eaten. Immediately after this, he got into a boat with his disciples and crossed over to the region of Dalmanutha. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. This is an interesting story in the sense that it feels like a repeat. And it feels that way in many ways because it is a repeat. So if you go back in your mind a few weeks, or if you want to just go back a few chapters, the feeding of the 5,000 happens in Mark chapter 6, starting at verse 30. So that's really only a chapter and a half back. These stories are very close together. And the pattern is repeated, right? They find themselves in the desert or the wilderness. Jesus asks them to take an inventory of how much food they have, and then he asks the crowd to sit. He breaks the bread and blesses it. The disciples distribute it. Everybody eats enough, and then they gather the leftovers. All of those details are exactly the same in both stories. So, if we were doing a convenient run through the Gospel of Mark, we might skip over this one because it is so similar to the one before. It feels like maybe there isn't something new in this story. The storyteller even begins by telling us there was another large crowd, as if we might not remember. And in some ways, we are reminded, and I feel like we take that memory into the story with us because we're sort of surprised that it's happening again, but nobody in the story seems to be surprised. Right? None of them seem to be carrying knowledge from the previous story into this one. So that leaves us a little bit confused. And some of this could be, a storytelling strategy. But I wanted to kind of play with that confusion. Because it's easy for pastors like me, even for us as just common story readers at home doing our devotions, we sit down and we look and we try to experience the story through the disciples because we are modern day disciples. We're trying to experience the story through the eyes of the people following Jesus because we follow Jesus. That's the only perspective we can take in this story. And the disciples haven't learned a single thing, it seems. This week as I was at camp, we did the same. We did the feeding of the 5,000. We used the story from the Gospel of John, but similar details. And I thought it would be fun to give the campers a chance to imagine themselves in the story. And my cold was worse, and so I needed to have a strategy to talk less. So I gave them an assignment. We were sitting down in chapel, we were outside, I had about 45 minutes of time with them. So I said, okay, we're going to have, here's how the story starts. Jesus is speaking to a crowd, but it's been a long presentation, and the crowd is hungry. Jesus asks the disciples how much food they have. They don't have much, so what happens next? Just go wild. Think about what could happen next. And the only rule was you can't say what actually happens next. So they went off into their little groups, and they were strategizing what would be the most interesting ending to the story. And I didn't give them limitations on time. I didn't say you can only use technology and business ideas from that time. I didn't say you have to be limited by the bounds of reality, of science. I didn't give them any limitations whatsoever. So I'll go through some of the examples that the kids thought of. I thought they were pretty creative. One, there's kind of a backstory here, but one group said if they were the disciples, they would all go on strike because it's just too much work for them to have to figure out all of this stuff. Now, that kind of fits with what we see sometimes. It's a lot of work. Why should the disciples have to do all of this extra thinking? Another group said, okay, well, how about the disciples just sneak out for a bit to the nearby Tim Hortons, and they just order 10,000 donuts and just bring those back to the hill. Another similar idea said that they would go to McDonald's and get 10,000 chicken nuggets. All of these ideas, creative, fun. Another group had a story with buffalo. I forget that one. But it was fun to see how they didn't feel the needs to be realistic, which fits because this is a miracle story. In a miracle story, we aren't bound by the limitations of time and space and science and technology. So their minds went wild and they came up with crazy things. And so we kind of now, through a little bit more realistic eyes, then we look at the disciples and we can ask similar questions like, what were they thinking? Because one of them should have been able to say, hey, Jesus, I was paying attention last time. I know exactly what happened. I was listening. I was taking notes. We can just do exactly the same thing. It'll work because you've still got the same skills. We're still the same disciples, pretty much the same crowd here. No reason to do anything different. We were paying attention. We got this one. None of it. So instead of focusing on what was the same, maybe we can look at what is different. The numbers are different. So in the feeding of the 5,000, they take home 12 baskets of leftovers. Those numbers are important. There are 12 disciples, but there's a Jewishness to the number 12. There are 12 tribes of Israel. 12 factors into a long list of stories. And even though it's a similar situation geographically in that they're both in the desert or the wilderness, depending on what your translation says, these are different places. The feeding of the 5,000 happens in Jewish territory. And in the story, Jesus is referred to as the Good Shepherd. Right? Because Jesus looks at the crowd and says he feels bad for them because they are like sheep without a shepherd. Jesus is calling himself the shepherd, which is an Old Testament image. In this story, there are 4,000 people that need to be fed. At the end, there are 7 baskets. They start with 7 pieces of bread. These are not historically Jewish numbers. 7 is consistent in the sense that there were 7 days of creation. But 7 is a broader, more common number in the cultures around them. So in this story, there are non-Jewish numbers. There aren't any Jewish Old Testament alliterations or references to Jesus in this story. And we've also just come through a number of stories in Gentile territory where some long-held Jewish assumptions are going to fall by the wayside. So, I'm not going to ask you to show you've been taking notes for the last few sermons. That's fine. But let's go back we can just kind of look at the headings of chapter 7 stories. So Jesus enters into a new community, and his disciples are eating food in a way that offends the Jewish leaders. And Jesus tells them that what they eat can't possibly contaminate them, but by what they do, what comes out of their mouths, what comes out of their heart. It's a good lesson for us today, but it was scandalous to the Jewish audience that first heard it. And then there's the story of the Syrophoenician woman who comes to Jesus in between Jesus doing more Jewish things, and she is not Jewish, and she needs Jesus to heal her daughter. And then remember, this is the story where Jesus says this seemingly rude thing to her. Jesus says, I've only come to help the Jews, not the Gentiles. And then she, because she loves her daughter that much, she kind of gives Jesus attitude. She doesn't let Jesus have the last word because, as I sort of argued then, that wasn't really Jesus' real word. But she says, yes, but even the dogs are able to eat from the table, right? Because Jesus didn't just stop and say, well, I'm only here to help the Jews. He says it isn't right to give to the dogs the food that belongs to the children. Right? We would be offended if anybody would talk about us that way. But she doesn't stop there. She says, yes, but the dogs still eat the crumbs that fall off of the table. Right? There's still room for the Gentiles to be blessed, isn't there, Jesus? And what does Jesus do? He heals her daughter. He celebrates her faith. All of this happens in ways to sort of shake the understanding that Jesus, the Messiah, has only come for the people of Israel. Jesus uses this illustration only a few verses before, where the woman says, yeah, but the dogs at least get to eat the crumbs. And now Jesus is in Gentile territory, and there's a Gentile crowd, and they're not going to eat crumbs. They are going to eat and be filled. So, a number of people have said this is a message from the gospel writer here to the church, especially the early church, saying this is not just a movement for the Jews. The church is open to the whole world. Jesus is giving a blessing to the Gentiles, inviting the Gentiles to eat at the same feast as the Jews. So in this story, it also says that the crowd has come from a long way off. So in the story of the feeding of the 5,000, we have a crowd, and it says people were coming and going, and that they were from the nearby cities. So we kind of get a different image of who those people are. They were sort of local, but Jesus fed them just as a matter of convenience. Now, this is a huge crowd, and they've come from a long ways. Such a long walk that Jesus doesn't think they can walk home without passing out. So Jesus is telling his disciples, but also the storyteller is telling us, these people have come from far away, from outside of what is close. Right? There's almost a sort of a poetic sign here. Jesus is feeding the whole world here. These people have come from a long ways off. Jesus' blessings aren't limited to just the people who are close by. In this story, there's so many things that are repeated and predictable, but those repetitions are after the earlier signs that this is a different crowd, in a different place. So in both stories, the disciples are bewildered or confused. And the disciples, in the common English, when Jesus says we're going to feed them, the disciples say, how can anyone get enough food in this wilderness to satisfy these people? Right? The disciples are confused. It seems like they're confused a lot, but they are in an unfamiliar place, right? Wilderness and desert, like I said before, are translated the same, but they're far away from stores. They're far away from anything familiar for them. And we don't know why they haven't spoken up earlier, but all of a sudden it's on them. I can't help but think that when Jesus said, man, I feel bad for this crowd, they're going to be hungry. And the disciples must have been thinking, yeah, Jesus, we're here too, right? We've been here for 3 days. We haven't bought any new food in that time. We're hungry. What about us? A 3-day teaching session. There's no explanation for that part either, which sounds strange to me. But Jesus is in the wilderness for 3 days. And one of the things that's becoming strangely familiar is that we have a story where Jesus is teaching, and he isn't teaching different crowds, he's teaching the same crowd over the course of a weekend. If someone were to speak even 8 hours a day for 3 days, there would be more words written down than would fit in the entire Gospel of Mark, probably the entire New Testament. So we want to know what Jesus was teaching, but rather than give us any of that, Mark simply says, okay, Jesus was teaching for 3 days. Okay, but what was he teaching? Right? I would love to know that. I don't know if I would read through every word. It would take a while. But we would love to know what Jesus was teaching for 3 days. The content of it probably would line up with what we see Jesus teaching in other places. That might not surprise us. But to keep a crowd interested for 3 days. I've been up here 15 minutes and I've lost some of you already. How does Jesus keep a crowd interested for 3 days? So this much already should stand out to us as readers. The people who went to hear Jesus, they might have packed for a day. They might have heard, oh, hey, Jesus is going to be a few towns over. let's pack an afternoon bag. Or, hey, it might go long, let's pack a few meals. But 3 days. 3 days. Jesus has been speaking to the crowd, and they've come from a distance, so they're like, well, yeah, let's stick around, let's get our money's worth out of this. But all of them have gone beyond the food that they prepared for themselves. A few people might have brought extra food, but by now, anybody who brought extra has already shared around their extra, and now everybody's getting tired and hungry. So Jesus is the kind of speaker where rather than cut things short and send people home, he keeps talking, and then he says, how about I just miraculously feed you all since I kept you so long? There's a message here that's so subtle we miss it. Jesus is speaking to Gentiles. It's almost certainly a mixed crowd, but this is a Gentile territory. Jesus has done things in the previous stories to bless Gentile individuals and communities. So partly, maybe what's happening is Jesus is giving Jewish background to the stories that he's telling. He has to speak to a Gentile audience. None of them are going to know the details of who David was and who Moses was. They're not going to understand the covenantal promises that Jesus came to fulfill. So maybe it takes extra time for that part of it. But Jesus is willing to fill in those gaps. Jesus is willing to connect the dots so that the people who have to come from farther away, the people who have to learn more, he's willing to help them learn so that everybody else can still sit around the same table. The contrast in this, in the Gospel of Mark, is fascinating when we put these together. Right? We've seen stories of Jesus going into synagogues, the heart of learning about Jewish religion and culture. Jesus goes into the synagogue where they should know all of the things. They should know all of the things that Jesus is talking about already. Jesus reads one verse and they can't handle him anymore and kick him out. Now Jesus is in the desert and he's surrounded by 4,000 Gentiles, and they can't get enough for 3 days. There's a challenge in this story. Yes, Jesus has the power to heal. Yes, Jesus has the power to give life. Yes, Jesus is a dynamic and powerful speaker. The challenge isn't to see Jesus that way. We see Jesus that way, that's fine. But Jesus is so compelling that even people outside of the people of Israel are interested. Even people outside of the church are interested. And it isn't that they're interested in the Jewishness of it. Right? This crowd didn't cease to be Gentiles after this. Right? Just because people like Jesus doesn't mean that they're going to start behaving like Mennonites. Right? That shouldn't come as a surprise to us. But the table is being served. Right? Jesus has extended an invitation to the banquet. And we will be surprised by who is there. We will be surprised by the excitement that other people show to be at that banquet. When there's a repetition in the Bible, it's generally a sign for us to pay attention to the deviations. A long time ago, I did a sermon series on the family tree of Jesus. And we looked at Matthew's genealogy. And a genealogy is a boring repetition of fathers and sons and fathers and sons and fathers and sons. But every now and then, there's a deviation. Right? Obed was the father of Jesse. Jesse was the father of David. David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Solomon was the father of, wait a second, what's going on with the deviation? Right? You're supposed to pay attention when the details change. Right? This crowd was here. Jesus fed them miraculously, yes, but they were there for 3 days. And we don't have to make connections to the Old Testament stories to do this. No. The feeding is the same. The crowd is different. The feeding is the same. The understanding of the crowd is different. The feeding is the same. Where the crowd comes from is different. The feeding is the same. The knowledge of what the crowd knew, the cultural situation is different. The feeding is the same. I hope you're catching the pattern. We can do the same thing in our life. Right? We know this place. We know these stories. The yearning is the same. Jesus' love is the same. But the people outside of these doors, the people in our communities, their yearning is the same. Jesus' love is the same. Just like the people of Israel, we have a capacity and a habit of wanting to see ourselves elevated a little bit. I do. I want to live a better life. I want to make better decisions than the people around me sometimes. And sometimes when other people suffer, it feels good to say, see, I made better decisions. Right? I switched into the right lane, and now I get to go through, and you guys stayed in the wrong lane, and it's your own problem. Right? We want to elevate ourselves because of our good decisions, and then we connect the rewards that we're getting with how Jesus has also elevated us, just like the Jews. But it's not true. Jesus loves us. Jesus elevates us. Jesus wants to be close to us, absolutely. But outside of that circle, people's decisions are different. People's culture is different. Language is different. Choices are different. Values are different. But Jesus' love is the same. So we can see Jesus' power in this. We can see the details of Jesus' miraculous healings and feedings. But the message is the love. No matter what else is different, the love is the same. So may we lean on that love, and may we share that love with the world around us.